Welcome back to Pace Immigration, paceimmigration.com, talking once again with immigration lawyer Andy Semichuk. Andy, good to see you.
Hi, Sean. Good to see you.
We're talking today about criminal admissibility. So a lot of talk after COVID, the vaccine is out and borders are starting to open up, and the land border between the U.S. and Canada is starting to become more flexible, and that brings about people wanting to travel. Unfortunately, a criminal conviction in someone's past could trip them up, and we get a lot of questions about that. So, Andy, let's just ask the question straight out. Can I cross the border with a criminal record?
Yes, you can, but it depends. And it depends on what is the nature of the record. So, for example, a simple assault, one simple assault may get, now we're talking about U.S. immigration here. The Canadian one is a little bit different, but we're talking about U.S. mainly here. So let's say you have a simple assault on your record, but that's it. That's not usually a problem. There's this thing called the petty offense exception, which allows a person, even though they've sinned, shall we say, in the past with a minor offense, what might be considered like a misdemeanor in the United States or summary conviction offense, to be able to go across the border. But it's tricky. It's not every minor offense. There are some offenses, for example, theft offenses, that even though it seems minor, it still may require what's called a waiver.
Okay, let's move on to a couple of specifics that we got questions about. Unfortunately, DUI, or drunk, as they call it in the States, or drunk driving, where they call it pretty much everywhere, is still quite prevalent. People do get arrested and convicted for it. And we do get questions from people saying, how about a DUI or a drunk driving conviction on my record? Can I cross into the U.S. or Canada, and vice versa, back and forth?
Okay, so the U.S. treats DUI slightly different than Canada. If you have a DUI, that is to say an impaired driving, say in Canada, and there's no loss of property or loss of life or any harm done, it's possible that you might be able to get into the U.S. with that one conviction. That's not the case with Canada. Canada has sort of escalated this offense, considering it a serious offense, and unless you committed it a long time ago, in which case you might still be treated by the old rules, which would possibly allow you to come into Canada. In most cases, if you have a DUI now from the United States, you would have to apply for what's called the temporary resident permit through the Canadian consulate, probably either in New York or Los Angeles, depending on where you live in the United States. Canada, okay. That's the Canadian side. And right. The side, if you have more than one, now you're in trouble. Now you have to apply for a waiver to go into the United States.
Okay, and we're going to talk about temporary resident permits and waivers in just a second. I wanted to cover another one, drug convictions, which all countries take a dim view of a drug conviction. The U.S. and Canada, no different.
Right. Yeah. If you're going to the U.S., for example, on a visit, maybe some important events such as a family gathering, a marriage, or a funeral or something like that, even if you have a drug conviction, it may be possible for you to get into the United States, depending on how serious the conviction or convictions are. The more serious, the more unlikely. Otherwise, if you're applying to go to the United States permanently, in that instance, the only exception there is to a bar to entry is possession of marijuana less than 30 grams. So if you're caught with some marijuana less than 30 grams, you could still get permanent residence in the United States. Otherwise, any drug conviction, such as, opium or heroin or anything of that nature, or trafficking in or any of these kind of offenses, will all lead to a bar to an application for permanent residence.
Yeah, I was going to say, it depends, as we've highlighted here, the amount and the type of substance, doesn't it? As you were saying, so it's less than 30 grams of marijuana is one thing. If you're caught with a kilo of cocaine, it's quite another.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
All
and
right.
An area that's tricky. It's not something that one would want to tackle on their own without legal help, I would say.
Right. So let's move on to the legal process itself. We've highlighted here temporary resident permit. In Canada, you need an entry waiver if you want to get into the United States. These are basically the same thing. They're just calling them a couple of different things. Yeah. The question we get most of the time is how long does it take to get one and how long is it good for? And an example is someone calls you up and says, hey, my buddies are having a bachelor party down in Las Vegas in a couple of weeks, and I just found out that my 2 DUI convictions might bar me. Can I get down to Las Vegas in the next 2 weeks?
Yeah, we get a lot of that. A lot of people phone saying they have some predetermined event that they need to attend, either in Canada or the United States, and can we get the waiver or temporary resident permit by that date? And usually it's like a month or two at the most away. Almost invariably, the answer is no, especially with COVID right now, because in the case of you wanting to go to from the United States to Canada, for example, this is a matter that has to be approved at the Canadian consulates, and they're overloaded right now because of the pandemic, and they're not processing applications in any hurry. So there'll be a long wait, and I don't think it's really a good time to be applying for a temporary resident permit unless you have a special reason for coming to the U.S., an essential kind of reason for coming from the U.S. to Canada, such as a funeral or some medical emergency. The U.S. is processing waivers through their new eSafe system, which is online. But again, you have to get biometrics done at the border. Not every border crossing will do it. They used to do it at Pearson Airport, but that's closed down now in the Ontario region. So you have to go down to Buffalo to get your biometrics, that is to say your fingerprints done, which is a part of the application. So you have to make an appointment for that. It's doable, but again, it's slow motion in terms of what it used to be before the pandemic.
Now, people do ask, how long are these good for? Are these one-shot deals, or do you get a waiver and now you're good for 5 years, say?
Okay, it depends on the offenses. It's very doubtful that anybody will get right off the bat a permanent waiver or temporary resident permit. It's usually for, let's say, a year in the beginning, then 3 years, then 5 years, and ultimately maybe rehabilitation may come along. So it's dependent on the offense, but initially it's usually a short period, 1 or 2 years.
I have heard from people that they'll say, well, it was a long time ago. And they're very surprised, I think, that sometimes they go into these computers and take a look and they'll find a conviction from even 20 years back and you can have a hard time. Is that right?
Very often, reasonably often, clients are calling about that. I've been traveling to the US for years and years, and this last time when I was going in, they picked up some conviction or some offense that I was involved in. I had forgotten about like 20 or 30 years ago. What's going on? And the answer is that the border officials are sharing their databases, and it's taking time for them to, meld. And so they are picking up these old offenses which need a waiver or a temporary resident permit. And as a result, surprise, surprise, you're going into the U.S. and finally they've gotten through their data clearing, and sure enough, they picked up an old conviction. Just the way it is, man. And if that's the case, we have to deal with it through a waiver or an application.
Yeah, and that's when you call Andy Semichuk, isn't it? Andy, what's your advice to someone in terms of timing? If someone's watching this and they're saying, okay, I'm not going to travel right now because of COVID or something like that, but certainly in 2022 or 2023, I am going to want to travel at some point. How much headway or lead time do you need in order to get something like this done?
Well, I would suggest as follows. If you have what might be a more serious conviction of some kind along the lines of what we've been discussing, I would consider it a long-term goal to get your clearance, your waiver or your temporary resident permit out of the way, meaning at least 6 months, more than 6 months in terms of waiting until you get it. And I just wanted to add that sometimes a person, if there are extraordinary circumstances, can get a waiver at the port of entry in emergency situations. For example, coming into Canada, you have a temporary resident, you have a DUI, you're looking for a temporary resident permit, and there's an emergency, someone has gotten very sick or has been in an accident and their close family member. It is possible for the border official to waive the requirements and give you a temporary resident permit at the border, but those situations are very rare. Generally, I would plan for a year, really, to get my record clear.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't know. It would have to be, if it's an emergency, certainly give it a try. But there's no guarantee that the border official will let you across the border just because it's an emergency, even if they believe you. Andy, thanks for the advice once again. People can contact you at Andy. It's Andy Semichuk at Semichuk@pacelawfirm.com. You've also got a website at myworkvisa.com with a lot of answers there as well. Andy, great to see you. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks again, Sean.